Hey everyone, welcome back to the Craftsman's Guide. I'm Cameron and I just want to say a huge welcome to all of the new subscribers that we've got on this channel in the past couple of days. The amount of support that I've received is super appreciated and I'm blown away. Now onto the crafting side of things. Bardscraft in his recent videos has been using pigment powders and I am mind blown with the results that you can get using them. I did have a look online and they were pretty expensive and my broke uni student account cannot afford them. So I found a cheap alternative and I'm going to show you guys how you can make your own pigment powders at home for a really cheap price. All you're going to need is to grab a soft pastel palette. You can get them from most $2 stores, most artist stores. This one cost me $2.80. You can't get much cheaper and I got a huge amount of pigments. I'm going to show you how. Let's get to it.
So creating pigment powders is really simple. These pastels you buy are essentially just condensed versions of pigments. So when you buy a big pack, you get a huge variety of all different colors and shades. The difficult part is knowing how to use them. These are fantastic because you can pick and choose colors, mix them, and get some really cool patterns, colors, and textures on your terrain. So before we get to the carnage of breaking them down, I went through and selected a bunch of different colors that I thought would look good together. You can always leave them by themselves as well if you want very specific colors. Once that I had my colors decided, I got a plastic bag. I recommend using a thicker plastic because these went everywhere when, well, I started doing this. Essentially, you want to break them down however you can. I ended up resulting to using a spatula and just crushing them because I couldn't find my hammer. You'll probably want to make it as fine as you can. Now this is where the tricky part comes. Depending on how you apply them can give really varying results. So I played with them for a few days and ended up with some pretty cool techniques which I want to share with you. The first is going to be dry application. This particular way of applying them gives it a really dusty and old sort of rundown look which I really liked. What I love about the pigments is the sort of finishing and weathering texture that they give. This well was destroyed but it never looked quite good enough. And once that I'd done these pigments, I was blown away at how good they looked. Now you can just leave pigments dry like this, but they do tend to rub off over time, especially if you use it a lot. I used a homemade black wash to bind the pigment to the piece, just stippling it on very gently, making sure I wasn't wiping it off. This also darkened the pigment and gave it a really nice worn texture. The next technique I wanted to show you was on this modular playable interior. I wanted to give the illusion of a stone fireplace without there actually being one, so what better way than to add some soot and some charcoal. I applied the pigments on dry and then used a wash to sort of sediment them in. Then with a brush I applied some wash, dabbed at it with a paper towel and pushed it around. This gave it a really nice sort of sooty, worn texture. But that wasn't the last thing I wanted to do. With the wash still on the brush, I dabbed it into the brown pigment and began applying it everywhere. This gave it a sort of gritty, dirty, muddy texture around the base of the house, which if it was a forest house, it gets wet, it gets muddy, it would definitely get caked a little bit. Once the piece dried, it had a couple of different various tones and a really nice texture. With that in mind, I moved on to creating a sort of muddy wet path. First applying very heavy pigments all over the areas where I wanted mud to be. Then I wet my brush and began to apply the water to all of the pigment, not worrying about disturbing it because it would pick up the pigment and spread it around almost like a textured wash. I wasn't afraid to get it into the flocking as well because it gave a more realistic transition. Where the pigments wouldn't rest on a wall, I applied some water to the brush, dipped it in the pigment, and then began to spread it around. It almost worked as a textured paint, but it was watered down and when it dried, it sort of caked on like dirt. I used the same technique in a different way on this bridge. I had some green pigment and wanted to give the flocking a bit of depth and volume. So with the bluey green pigment, I applied it to the stone like I would with moss. And to mix a couple of different techniques, I dry applied some pigment to the bridge to give it a nice sort of old weathered look, making sure that I focused between the crevices and where the stone would have been broken. Mixing these different techniques gives it a much more realistic weathering. To add a bit of depth to the flocking, I applied some brown to the greener areas to give it a sort of dead and withered look in some places, making sure it was sporadically placed to be more realistic and believable. And finally, my favorite thing you can do with pigments. Add glowing effects so easily with just a paintbrush. Here I added the effect to some mushrooms and some runes, but you can do the same with fire or any light source, and gives a really realistic and nice glowing effect with very little effort. and that's how you can make your own pigment powders at home and add amazing detail to your builds in a super easy and cheap way. Let's take a look at all the different pieces once they've dried. I can't wait to use these pigments on the bigger projects which I have in the works. The amount of detail you can get and the weathering effect using pigments is absolutely amazing, and I'm really happy with the results. So it's pretty safe to say that I'll make pigments a regular appearance in my bigger builds in future videos. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. I appreciate it. If you liked it, please consider liking, leaving a comment letting me know what you want to see next, subscribing, and head over to my Instagram and Patreon for more exclusive content. And as always, I'll see you on the next adventure.